Hi, Mike Amison here, talking to you about designing and building great web APIs. Thought I'd do a little session on just what my project file looks like. I use NPM and Node for all of the work that I do. So I thought I would show you how I lay out my project. This is the same way all the projects in the book are laid out, and it gives you sort of a hint into the parts that I really concentrate on. So let's go ahead and switch over to this is basically a tree list of the content of one of my projects. This is the company project. You'll see this a lot when you're working in the book. And we'll just kind of work through the series here. So the asset folder is a really important folder in the work that I do. The asset folder is actually where all the design work comes from. So you can actually see there's a story file here. That's usually my narrative, my story. I'll either pick that up from someone else who's delivered it to me, or I'll collect the information up and put it together. From that comes the workflow. I actually kind of get an idea of how things are supposed to flow, if there's a sequence at all, or if things can be done in parallel. And then I generate my WSD diagram, which creates the PNG, which is the actual diagram of the service. Then I usually move on to the vocabulary. So I pick out all of the action names, all of the data property names, and put them in one location. I'll normalize those. We talk about that in the book. That's really part of the designing process. It's really the vocabulary that we all share with everyone. So it's important to have that sorted out on the way. And then when it comes finally time to produce something out of the design process, the final element is this ALPS document. So that's the application level profile semantics. You'll hear me talk about that. I devote a whole chapter to that in the book. And that's really the blueprint that developers can start to work with. So I can hand this over to a developer and she knows exactly what to do with it and how to get started. And usually the first things that happen is to add a few more assets to the folder. And the first is this apiary blueprint. I use apiary blueprint to do sketching. So we might do some sketches together, figure out just what this interface is supposed to look like, what are the features, how is it going to be put together. Once we get sketching done, we can actually do a definition file. And in my case, all the work in the book is going to be done with HTTP REST style. So I'm going to use Swagger or Open API. I use the Swagger Hub editor, so that's why you see the names here, but I'll create both a JSON and a YAML usually, because it depends on what tooling you have. I always work in version 3, but you may still have some tools that need to use the JSON. So I usually produce both of those. That's the asset folder. Once I've got that asset folder populated and checked in, then really it's time to go ahead and start building the code. Now, one of the things that I do, you'll see in all of the examples, is I use a little library kit called Dart, which is for data, action, resource, representation, and transition. So that's actually the framework that I work in. This is just a tiny little library that I put together that makes it easy for me to translate the description and the definition into an actual working application. So you can actually see here that this library has a data file, an action file, representation file, resources, and transitions. So the data and action are perfectly make sense just as you think about it. All of the data properties that I'll be dealing with, which ones are enumerated, which ones are required, which ones have default values, and that's all in one place. The action elements are the actual functions. That's the work that we're supposed to be doing. Update a record, submit for review, approve, so on and so forth. Those are usually just simple functions, little promises that I do. Then we get into the notion of resources. Resources expose the actions so that I can collect the data properties and put them in the proper place. So that's a really big part of this as well. So resources is typically, the thing that everybody sees. You normally build a sort of a resource-oriented API. This is what you're going to have. I use Express, so it's pretty simple. It's get this, put that, so on and so forth. Representation is a really important element in my design. So I'm going to represent that data on the outside as some way. Do you want it as HTML? Do you want it as CSV? Do you want it as plain JSON, plain XML? Or do you want it as structured JSON like HAL or Siren or collection JSON or Uber or Mason? Or do you want it as some other format? So this is where we get to decide how we're going to translate our internal objects that come from our actions into a shared message. So strong typing messages is how we work on the web, and that's what this is for. And there you'll see there are a few representers that are pre-built. So the plain JSON, a forms JSON, a link JSON, a thing called Prag JSON, which I work with, and text CSV. Usually I have an HTML in here, but since I'm doing all APIs, I don't have it. Finally, the last one is the transitions. Transitions are really important because transitions actually describe the way that you can move from one state to the next. How do I add a new record? How do I search? How do I filter? How do I find? And so on and so forth. That's exactly what happens in the transitions. We'll talk about those in the book quite a bit, and you'll get a sense of how transitions work. I always have a folder for localized data. I try to ship the data with the service. That doesn't always work. A lot of times I'm working with external data or I'm working with another API that holds the data, but I almost always have some kind of data here locally myself. And then on the outside, I've got just your basic starting index file, the packages, the node modules, things like that. Now you'll also notice there's this launch. There's a launch.sh and config and an output. I actually have a little sort of pipeline-ish piece where I actually launch some localized test. If the tests pass, then I actually launch a little deployment script into Heroku. And if that passes, then I actually run the test against the Heroku deployed element as well. So that's actually what happens in that launch piece. And we get into the deployment section of the book, you'll find out how I use those. Now, in the case of security, I've got a pretty simple setup. There's a library that goes with the security that's built into the Dart framework, but there's also a few things that I do locally. I need to be able to pull a token so that I can use tokens in tests. I need to be able to do some curls with that token to make sure that I can run some local tests and things like that. So you'll see a bunch of scripts in my routine in a security folder, and that's usually an auth script, an auth config, and then a curl auth. Now I use auth0 as my identity source and as my access control storage. So that's why you'll see auth0 here, but you can adjust these for others. And again, there's a whole chapter where we talk about that. Finally, we get down to the test space. Tests are really, really important. I actually talk about two kinds of tests. I'll skip down to the bottom here, and you'll see these things called SRT list and SRT output. So simple request transactions are really the way I do simple tests. So it's literally a statement for curl. You place this inside a curl string. I can post, put, get, delete, all that kind of stuff. Every time I write a change of any kind, as soon as I hit save, I'll run the SRTs. SRTs run in milliseconds. It's super fast. I'll have both sad path and happy path SRTs. This is especially true when I'm working on error conditions, but I'll always have the SRTs handy, and I always have those with me. Now, when I want to do some real down and dirty testing, well, I use Postman. So I use a Postman script. I use the Postman editor to write most of it. I've got a library and a few other things. I'll talk to you about that in the book. But then what I also do is I have my own shell scripts that allow me to pull the collection from Postman, pull the proper environment variables, and then run all that stuff locally. So you'll see my Postman environment's got my API key and some other things like that. And then I've got some test output, a test run configuration, and the test run script itself. Now, what I do is I actually use Newman to do that test work. So Newman is the local runner for Postman. You can download that from NPM. It's very, very powerful. And Newman, you can get to also output some really sweet HTML report. So it isn't just plain text, it's actually kind of a nice color-coded HTML report. So you'll see lots of that stuff in the test folder as well. Now I'll check in my SRT output results. I'll check in my Newman results simply because I want that history, but often I overwrite those over and over again. So it's something that sort of stays clean. You won't see a long history of tests. Otherwise I'd have thousands and thousands of them in the lifetime. So that's what it is. There's a test folder, there's a security folder. At the root, there's a launch and an index. I keep my own localized data. There's my Dart framework folder, and then there's my design assets folder. And I would take this with me wherever I go. I check this into GitHub or GitLab or any other source that you have, and then I can pull this from any location and then run it locally. And that's what my projects look like for designing and building great web APIs.